Today we're doing an effect called frequency separation, which is a high-end retouching effect. And I'll show you where I learned the steps of this effect. There are lots of publications if you Google frequency separation online, but I found this one to be a very clear instructional website. I'll show you the before and after. If I here is the real Mona Lisa. If I option click on the original image, here's my before, and you can see that before I did the frequency separation technique, there's a lot of readiness here in the face and fine lines in the eyes, and then I also added a warming layer to try to make the face match the cardboard body a little bit. So if we option click, here's the after and here's the before. So you can see that's a big difference, and I'm not quite done yet. There's some areas that are still uneven up here on the eyelid. But basically we've evened out the mottled skin tones, we've added warmth to the face, and we've overall added a little bit more contrast to the image. Here's the warmth here. And basically the frequency separation allows us to separate the image into two categories. We always keep the background layer on. This is a destructive process, so we need to duplicate the background layer a couple of times. The high frequency is used for isolating textures such as blemishes and lines. And so it separates out kind of the black and white pixels of the image, which make up the structure of the image, of the lines and so forth. And so we retouch directly on the high frequency layer when we're trying to minimize these areas. And so we use the retouching tools like the cloning stamp and the healing brush in the current layer sample option mode to retouch directly when we're working on getting rid of lines and things that we don't want anymore. Like, let's see, get rid of that guy there. And you see that it doesn't completely take them away. It simply minimizes them more. And then the low frequency, I'll just turn off the high frequency and turn on the low frequency. You can see ends up being very, very blurry. And we use this layer simply to smooth out tones and color. It's blurry anyway, the texture's gone. So anytime we retouch on it using these two tools, we're smoothing out tone and color. So let's just go ahead and throw away the frequency adjustment layer. I'm going to keep these two layers because I've already built those separately. To do the high frequency and the low frequency layers, I simply duplicate the background twice, and I'm going to call this low frequency and high frequency. And I'm going to turn off high frequency because all we're doing here is adding a blur to the low frequency layer. And the blur can be a Gaussian blur. It can be one of the other blurs of your choice. I'll just go ahead and do a Gaussian blur. And you can see that when we add a Gaussian blur at about 10, you can even go higher than that if you want to. Pretty much all of the texture and the shadow detail is gone, and we're left with just color and tone. And then I'm going to say OK. So that one is easy, creating the low frequency layer. Creating the high frequency layer, I'll go ahead and turn that one on, is a little more, has a few more steps involved. And this is the article that I read on FStoppers.com. And you can Google it if you want to. It's called The Ultimate Guide to the Frequency Separation Technique. And it's on FStoppers.com. And you can see that they're applying it actually to a very fashionista looking picture, which is probably more appropriate, but it works well on average portraits also. So you can see our low frequency area, the area that we just blurred, is going to control large areas of colors and tones. And the high frequency that we're going to create next really works, when we retouch on that layer, it works on fine details like skin pores, hairs, blemishes, and fine lines. So we're going to create this next layer now, the high frequency layer, and it requires a few more steps. Basically, we're going to select the high frequency layer and choose Image, Apply. And depending if you have a 16-bit or 8-bit color image, you're going to apply different settings based on that. They also have a link to a really fabulous video down here with these steps. So I'm going to go ahead and write down these steps here so that I don't forget them, or I'm going to refer to those steps there. And I'm going to go ahead and select the high frequency adjustment layer. Okay. And then choose Image, Apply Image. And basically what this does is it mixes the layers into one another. So I'm going to actually mix the low frequency layer into the high frequency layer. That's what we're doing here. In a subtract mode with a scale of 10 and an offset of 128. This is a starting point. You can play with this. If you want a little bit more finite adjustments, you can modify that and play with it. Then I'm going to say OK. Now this just looks plain weird. So I'm going to change this now into linear light is the recommended overlay mode. And you can see that it disappears, but the fine lines, or rather the gray disappears, but the fine lines remain behind. And when I turn on that low frequency, underneath it, it now looks normal. So if I option click on the background layer, it pretty much looks the same as if I have the high frequency and low frequency on together. You see that? They're off. Now they're on. It looks the same. So the change doesn't happen until I start retouching. And I use my traditional retouching tools, the clone stamp tool, the healing brush tool. I want to make sure I'm on the current layer, not the current layer and below, but the current layer. And in the high frequency mode, that's where, again, I'm going to be removing fine lines and blemishes. Okay, so you can just, with a small brush, go ahead and get to work on the fine lines, roll back the clock for me, and blemishes. We can try and get rid of that, although that looks pretty funny because those were pretty large. So you can go back in time if you make a mistake and maybe use a bit of a bigger brush. There we go. If you wanted to get rid of those. I've always wondered if I got them removed what it would look like. And then with this area here, so the high frequency is where you would get rid of blemishes and lines. With this area here, I would work in the low frequency mode and really start to smooth out color. Now when I use the healing brush, not a lot is happening here in the way of smoothing out the color. So I'm going to switch to the clone stamp. And I'm going to use a pretty hard or pretty soft brush to match the blurriness of the layer. And you can work in a low opacity like I have here at 22 and kind of build it on, or you can turn up the opacity and you'll see results much more quickly if you turn up the opacity. Although I'm not really happy with that, so I'm going to turn back down the opacity and build up this kind of effect. Let me go back in time. That's not looking good. There we go. Smoothing out color slowly. Switching between high frequency and low frequency. I can also smooth out shadows, like this one around my nose. I'm going to switch back up to high frequency and start working on some of these darker spots. And it just takes time. The nice thing about this technique over blurring the whole layer is that it does keep the integrity of the pore structure. So you're going to keep going until you get a nice smooth result. This was kind of a fast demonstration. I didn't get the best result because I have to keep going. Check out also the before and after on the web page here. This is the URL. You can copy it and paste it and put it into the browser, and it's the exact same steps I just